Alright, so today we're going to be watching U.S. Marines witness a paranormal event in Afghanistan by MrBallen. As always, I'm going to be leaving a link to the original video and channel down in the description below, so go ahead and make sure that you check them out. Now, I've been a fan of MrBallen for, the past month, and I just started binging almost every single thing he's been making. I believe he's been making videos for roughly about a year or so. He was a Navy SEAL. I believe he mentions that he got out in 2017, I believe it was. He started making TikToks about stuff that were paranormal. He had a while where he was doing things about the military, and then he settled in delivering stories in a strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format. I completely botched the whole thing, but that's his little catchphrase in his intros. I love his intros. Also, by the way, he always makes some little quip about hitting the like button, subscribe, and the bell button. And the thing that really stuck me out about this video was I actually had a little bit of an experience, I would say. Nothing too big, and I'll describe it more at the end. But since I see in the title here, observation post, right? Because mine happened when I was on post 2, when I was in Syria. So that's a little story I'll tell at the end. Somebody commented a little while ago that, hey, you should check out MrBallen. He's got a video about U.S. Marines seeing some weird stuff. And I was like, oh, I've been watching MrBallen pretty religiously at this point, always at night too, because teaching it as listening to it in a little bedtime story. But in any case, I thought this would be a good watch. And also, I don't know, I just like this dude's overall vibe and just the way he tells the story. Alright, so let's go ahead and get to the actual video. But before we do, don't forget to like, subscribe, it really does help me a lot. Hit that notification bell so you get notified every time I do upload. Let's go ahead and see what these U.S. Marines saw while they were on post in Afghanistan.
The paranormal does not really have a place in the military, despite what anybody tells you. It's just not something that gets discussed. Now, I was a bit of an anomaly. I was in the Navy for 7 years. 5 of those years were spent on a SEAL team, and maybe because we were in such small teams, people had to put up with my weirdness and my interest in, the strange happenings around the world. But
we're all kind of weird in our own way, so.
Really that was an anomaly. And I think it comes from the culture inside the military where you have a group of people that has such a intense job that's so rooted on practical approaches to problem solving. There is no time to be theorizing about how demons and ghosts and things that are out of this world are having an impact, because we need to focus on what's happening right now in front of us. There's no space for anything else. And so when you do hear stories coming out of the military that are paranormal in nature, it isn't that you should inherently believe them, but rather you should understand that if they have come to the conclusion that this is paranormal, they have ruled out virtually everything else. And so today I'm going to share a military paranormal story that happened in Afghanistan in 2009 when 8 U.S. Marines were stationed at this very isolated observation post in the middle of Helmand province. And some very strange things happened out there that the Marines that were there believe are still plaguing them to this day. But before we get into today's story, if you're...
Okay, so the part about when he also said about the paranormal is something that you would really put within the military, but obviously, these days, right? I mean, I don't know if you all saw that video. They're recently started to capture UFOs, and everyone's saying it's legit. But as far as the thing, with my little story, it was something that happened when it was at night. We're staying up for quite some time, because even on your off time, it's really hard sometimes to fall asleep, and you're trying to get to the gym, you're trying to get some food. So obviously you're a little tired, right? Because you're probably not getting as much sleep, not getting as much food as we were getting over there. We would get 3 meals a day, but they were kind of small portions. So sometimes people could even chalk it up to hey, because I told some of my buddies about them, hey, maybe you guys were just tired, but it's there was 2 of us on post. But you know what? Bottom line, they might always just chalk it up to fatigue and you're hallucinating because you're tired. But I'll get more into that at the end.
If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right channel, because that's all I do, and I upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, I would encourage you to play Ding Dong Ditch on the like button's house, and then also subscribe to this channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In June of 2009, US and NATO forces surged into Afghanistan. Troop numbers escalated dramatically in preparation for this massive offensive against the Taliban. During this surge, a very small team of Marines, 8 Marines, were given a mission to go to an observation post in Helmand province where a group of British soldiers were stationed at the time. An observation post, or OP as it's called in the military, is any location where you're able to observe, hence the name. Most OPs, if not all OPs, are located on high ground because
those 8 Marines are probably just a squad. I mean, typically the number's supposed to be 13, but obviously depending on how many people you have, sometimes we had a squad at one point that only had like around 8 people. I think it was 8 and even 7 at one point. But, just depends on how many people that you do have.
That provides you the best view. OPs are very strategically valuable. You have the higher ground and you can see what's going on around you. And so as a result, OPs become prime targets for attack. Now, the OP that these Marines were going to, OP Rock, was a little bit unique. It was strategically very important, but it didn't really have the higher ground. All around it were other large pieces of terrain, which meant if you poke your head up for too long, you might get shot from a sniper on the mountain. And so OP Rock was like a very dangerous and isolated place to be. Not to mention laughably small and had almost no amenities. It was basically a couple of HESCO barriers, those big brown squares that get filled with sand and dirt to stop bullets, and then not even cots. They slept literally on the ground on sleeping pads and a couple of ghillie tents overhead. That was about it. And so these Marines were going to be there for 60 days where they were not going to be able to go anywhere. They were just isolated and stuck on this tiny little wasteland in the middle of Afghanistan.
I would have been fucking miserable.
8 Marines were led by Sergeant Green, and his second in command was Corporal Lena. The other 6 junior Marines were Zolik, Hoyt, Wilson, Parker, Smith, and Gibbs. After driving their up-armored vehicles all the way through the snaking pass, they get to OP Rock, and the British soldiers are there anxiously waiting for them. Normally, anytime you turn over with any other unit, you do something called turnover operations, where because you're new to the area, you want to go out and do like a presence patrol or something to get a feel for the area with the people who have been there, to kind of give you a lay of the land and say, hey, look out for this area. We think there's IEDs over there. Remember, if you're over here, you're in plain sight of the enemy. They can shoot you. But when they got there, the British were so anxious to leave. They did not do turnover ops. The British just looked totally weathered and beaten down and ragged, like they'd been fighting at OP Rock for decades. But they'd only been there for 60 days, the same amount of time that these Marines are about to be there. And before they leave, one of the British soldiers turns and says, hey, just so you know, if you dig anything up here, just put it back. And the Marines look at him like, what are you talking about? And he doesn't elaborate. He just says again, if you dig anything up, just put it back. Trust me. So that night, the men have settled into...
Okay, so obviously that would be cause for concern. Like you said, like they're probably, because I still don't know what was going on. It says paranormal events. Obviously, quite a bit of things happened, and it seems like it was happening on maybe a consistent basis to the point where they just wanted to get out of there. And obviously, when they said that, they really didn't elaborate too much. I personally, nothing against the British, but I probably would have been pissed because I wouldn't know if maybe, hey, they're just messing with us, which I don't think they would do. But it's like, hey, man, you got to tell me, like, why is this? Is like, what is the reason? Or it could just be, I don't know, maybe something superstitious, but I would definitely be uneasy, especially when he said that 6 of the guys were junior Marines, right? Now, obviously, that would mean that it would be their first deployment, and I'm assuming the sergeant could have been his second, depending on how fast he got promoted. Could have been his third. Maybe he went for another contract. Corporal may have been his second deployment. So I'll be very on edge. So just, I don't know, for me personally, now I like to believe in the paranormal a little bit, just to kind of, but here, I'll get more into that at the end.
To their new home for the next 60 days. And the way it works on any base in the world, but certainly in a war zone, is there's always someone manning a guard post. And so the first night, it happened to be Corporal Lena's turn to be on watch. Corporal Lena is the second in command of these 8 Marines. And he was up in the guard tower, and you got to put yourself in his mind, okay? Even if you've never been to Afghanistan, just imagine being out in the middle of nowhere. like in the middle of a mountainous desert with no village, no people, no anything. But at the same time, you are hanging it out there. You are totally exposed. There are people in the mountains around you that want to kill you, for sure. And it's you and 7 other sleeping people right in your little tiny OP. All you got is a radio where you can call back to your main base that's far enough away that if something bad happened, you better hope that 1, you can get through to them, and 2, they can get over here as quickly as they can. And the great fear when you're in these remote locations is that you're going to get ambushed. There's so many stories about these complex attacks being launched on these small little outposts where all of a sudden groups like these 8 Marines just get totally overrun by the Taliban. So it's a terrifying thing. When I was in Afghanistan, I didn't stand all that much guard duty, but when I did, you're up in the shack and you're kind of looking out into this like vast expanse of kind of nothingness. And you're wondering, like, are people watching me right now? Is someone taking aim at me right now? I mean, you're protected and you're doing all the things you're supposed to do, but nighttime in Afghanistan, standing guard duty, it's very eerie. And so this first night, Lena is up there, it's very quiet, and his radio that's right next to him, like imagine like a big walkie-talkie, right? Military grade radio. It starts crackling. Military radios, at least American military radios, are from the 1950s and they have basically not changed. They're very durable and they work, but it's not uncommon for them to falter. And that's why we have people that specialize in just radios that can fix these things for us. Because if you lose your line of communication, you're screwed. And so he's sitting there and he starts hearing crackling on the radio. And so he notices it, but he doesn't think much of it. And the crackling stops and he's looking out into the mountainside and he's kind of looking around and just doing his typical guard duty. Then the crackling picks up again and he thinks he can hear someone speaking in the radio. It didn't sound like English. It didn't sound like even words necessarily, but it was a little bit louder. Now he's really paying attention to it. Because he was worried his radio might be going bad, he first took the battery off, looked at it, blew it off, reconnected the battery, rebooted it, and put it back down. And he's a little more keyed into his radio. And then a couple minutes later, he hears this crackling, and now he can clearly hear someone's voice. And it sounds like Russian. He thinks someone is speaking in Russian. This is an encrypted radio. You're not picking up random signals all over the place. You only are picking up people that have your crypto. And it doesn't make any sense to pick up somebody else's voice. This has to be someone on your team. And so he thinks, okay, I'll check in with the main base because my guys are all asleep right here. They're all sleeping right there, 7 of them. There's no beds. They're laying on the ground right there. I can count them. No.
I was going to say, too, maybe do like a radio check, just to at least make sure that the radio is working properly,
One's on the radio. So he picks up the radio and he calls into the main base and he says, hey, is anybody pushing traffic out this way to OP Rock? And like right away, they get a response from the main base that says, no, we're not pushing or receiving traffic. Lena's not terrified about this, but he's like, okay, there's something going on with the radio. The crackling and gurgling and weird sounds would persist throughout the night to the point where the next morning when the next guard came on duty, he said, hey, I think there's something strange going on with the radio. You should probably go switch it out and get somebody else's radio while you're up here. Lena's relieved of guard duty and he goes down to check on the other Marines. And at this point, everybody's awake and, it's the start of their first full day at OP Rock. And because they have nothing else to do besides defend it, they start taking stock of how well fortified is it, what are some ways that we can improve this place, and they notice that there's a trench dug around the inside of OP Rock, basically right up against the Hescos, that allows anyone to stand and not be jutting out of the OP and run the risk of getting shot by a sniper. And they're looking at it and they're thinking to themselves, it's not deep enough. It's maybe a couple feet down. You're certainly not going to be able to stand on this trench. You'll totally be exposed. And they thought, why didn't the British, who were here for 60 days, why didn't they dig a deeper trench? And so Lena and the rest of the Marines decide they're going to spend that day digging the trench a little bit deeper and a little bit wider. As they're digging, Lena hits something.
That's kind of one of the things too, especially if you're like in a defensive position or if you're just doing like little simple fighting holes, right? That you're in the prone, is that you're consistently fortifying it, right? Obviously, you got your sandbags, you got your sectors of fire, and then you put a little bit of not foliage, just like pieces of the terrain around it. Like say, if you're in a grass environment, you put some grass on there or something, anything to really like obscure it so you can't really tell if there's anybody there. You might even put like a tarp over, just depending on the situation or terrain, and just continuously keep fortifying it.
Metal in the trench, and he pulls it out, and it's like this metal stake, like an engineering stake. And he brushes off the dirt on the stake, and he's looking at it, and he can see some foreign writing, and it looks like Russian writing. And he's thinking to himself, oh, that's not that weird. Back in the 80s, the Russians were here, and it's totally possible that they may have left some of their gear here and it got buried. About 10 meters away from Lena is one of the younger Marines named Wilson, who's digging, and at some point he hits the ground and like a pocket in the soil opens up. And he sees there's some pottery and some pieces of what look like ceramics that are inside of this hole. And after pulling out some of the plates and pots, they pull out a huge human bone, a femur, your leg bone. They ultimately decide to tuck the leg bone back into where it was, and they stop digging in that area, and they continue to dig in the other sections of the trench. But they couldn't dig more than a couple inches before running into more human remains. And by the end of the day, they had unearthed dozens of skeletons inside of this trench. And so they realized that this is probably what the British meant when they said, if you dig something up, put it back. A couple of weeks go by, and the Marines at this point have accepted that they live in a very creepy place. And on day 13 of being at OP Rock, Hoyt, who had just turned 20 years old, is up on guard duty. As he's sitting there, he starts getting this really uncomfortable feeling that someone is right behind him. And so at one point, he turns around to look at what's behind him, basically looking back into the camp itself. And now, coming from outside the wire where he had just been looking, he hears this horrible, blood-curdling scream. He turns around and he's looking out. He's got his night vision goggles on. He's looking around for anything. And all of a sudden, a couple hundred meters away, he sees a man running between one bush to another bush. Now, they know that at any time they could get attacked. So they're not thinking that this could be anything other than the Taliban coming to attack them. And so the other Marines have jumped up because they heard the scream, and they're looking to Hoyt to be like, what's going on? Hoyt is saying to them, I got a guy, he's about 200 meters away. I just saw him running right to left. Lena runs over to the edge of the HESCO, and he raises his rifle with a thermal imager on it, and he's looking out, and there's no heat signature out there. It's totally cold. There's no animals, there's no people, certainly, there's nothing. And Lena is yelling to Hoyt, where is he? Where do I need to look? And Hoyt's saying, he's right there. I just saw him go behind that bush. But Lena is looking out and he can't see anything on thermal. And he's like, I don't see anything. There's no one out there. The Marines also had a dog that they inherited from the British soldiers that had been there. Her name was Ugly Betty. They loved Ugly Betty. They took care of her, and she was apparently really good at identifying when people were coming towards the OP. So she was a great watchdog. And this whole time, she had been looking in the same direction that Hoyt had seen this figure, and she is barking like a maniac. And even after they're looking with thermal and they can't see anyone out there, they can't get Betty to calm down. She's completely transfixed on the area where Hoyt had seen this figure. So for the rest of the night, the Marines are totally on guard, anticipating at any moment that they're going to get attacked. Someone's going to take a shot, they're going to throw a grenade in, because we lost this guy who was right there in front of us. So eventually, the next day, when they didn't...
Okay, so I feel like, at least my rational side, right? Like the side that would try to say that this isn't paranormal, right? If I was in that scenario, right? I mean, obviously, I don't know how I would react unless I was actually there. But if I saw that and I saw someone go by, and then, was it like 200 meters, right? And then they're looking at it with thermals, can't see any heat signature. My mind is going to go, maybe there's a little divot wherever that bush was. Maybe that person is hiding behind it. As far as I know, thermal can't go through, for example, if there was like sand or it's just something covering it. I mean, obviously I would assume that. I didn't really mess around with thermals too much. The only thing I really used were my PVS 14s or my NVGs. So I feel like that's what my rational side would try to tell me that it is. Hey, maybe there's someone hiding there. Obviously, be very risky to send out like 2 people, right? If you wanted to go check it out. Because all of a sudden, if that is the case, some guy could just pop out and just spray them, right? So at this point, but then the side of me that kind of believes in the paranormal a little bit would kind of just be like, fuck. I honestly, I wouldn't even know what to do in that scenario. I mean, because, very obvious that the military would not teach you what to do. I mean, obviously the thing would be, hey, maybe you're just fatigued, maybe you're just seeing things. I don't know.
Didn't get attacked. They just kind of said, okay, and they moved on and just figured it was an anomaly. Another couple of weeks later, on day 26, Zolik, who's another one of the younger Marines, was on guard duty, and it was really hot. He remembers even taking his helmet off because he was sweating so bad. And then at some point, while he's just looking out into the vast open nothingness, he said that the temperature dropped inside of the shack dramatically. So much so that he actually felt cold. There was no breeze, there was no reason for it to be getting cold. And as he's thinking to himself, like, is there a storm coming in or a cold front coming in? He starts feeling like someone's standing behind him. And he keeps looking over his shoulder and no one's there. He's in this tiny little shack. And he's feeling creeped out, and all of a sudden he starts hearing whispering from behind him. Not on the radio, but like in the shack with him. And he keeps turning around and he keeps thinking, like, am I hearing things? Am I losing my mind? And he starts hearing footsteps on the roof of his shack. And that's when he thinks, oh, Smith, who was the kind of class clown of the group, is playing a joke on me. He must be whispering outside. I bet he climbed up on top and he's screwing with me. So he jumps out of the shack and looks up, expecting to see Smith standing on the roof of the guard shack. But no one's on the guard shack. At this point, Zolik's pretty...
Okay, so a little bit based on that, I mean, obviously, I wouldn't doubt, someone would try to mess with you that's on the team that would be considered that class clown type, right? Just a little quick side story. I had a friend who was in security forces over in the East Coast, and then he said, I think it was deployed to Cuba. Shit, I forgot where he said specifically, but he was doing, one of his jobs was to actually go check out this pier. And then he said that there was like a little story or like a little thing that went around that, hey, there's an old lady that's supposed to become some kind of ghost that goes there. She messes with people that are there. And he didn't really think too much of it until he actually started hearing like a little tapping on the wood, right, of like this little pier. He assumed it was just somebody, right? Has his gun, cocks it back, says, hey, kind of just says out loud, I have a loaded gun, come out. Right? Nobody comes out. All of a sudden, he starts backing away. He's keeping his eye out. And then all of a sudden, somebody starts rushing. And instinctively, right, you see someone, this is at night as well, you see someone start kind of rushing you at night. He instinctively, right, tries to point his gun, tries to tell him to stop. And all of a sudden, the person pulls his hands up in the air and goes, no, wait, stop. Hey, it's me. And apparently his friend was trying to play a joke on him. And this... My buddy was pissed at him because obviously he could have shot him, right? So obviously that's not happening in this case, but don't do that. There's also another story about a lieutenant when I was in Syria. One of the guys that was on Post 1 or BP 1, there was a lieutenant that wanted to see if a Marine was paying attention, right? Which he was because BP 1, you're looking right at the front gate where we were at. And this lieutenant on green, while he was working on, decided it would be a good idea to jump through the fucking window. And then, obviously, the Marine points the rifle at him, but then quickly points it back down. And then the lieutenant tries to joke, hey, I was just testing you to see how alert you were. Because he had heard like people like taking off the gear, which sometimes we did. But he wanted to make sure that he didn't catch the Marine being an ass, right? Or like just fucking shit up. He didn't know how close he probably came to getting shot. And the Marine probably, who was on post, in my opinion, would have been in the right? Because you just see someone random just jump through the window immediately, right? So when you're on post, even if it's supposed to be a joke, don't do it. You might get someone killed.
He's spooked. He does a quick search on either side of the guard shack, thinking maybe Smith is there, but no one's there. And then he turns around and, of course, sees that the other 7 Marines are all asleep. So it wasn't Smith. It wasn't any of his teammates. At this point, he goes back in the shack and he raises his rifle and he's looking through his thermal scope. So any human would light up like a Christmas tree if you saw them on a thermal. And he's scanning outside all around thinking, did I hear someone who's out there? Because they had that weird run-in 2 weeks earlier with that random person that they could never find. He's thinking maybe there's somebody else out here. And as he's scanning, he sees a man standing a couple hundred meters away with his fists raised like this. Zolik was so caught off guard from the way he was standing that he actually lowered his rifle to look because the moon was pretty bright. The illumination was pretty good. And he looked, he couldn't really see him again, so he brought his rifle back up, and now through his thermal, the figure was gone. Zolik in interviews has admitted that he was really stressed out about being at OP Rock. He was really down. I think of all the Marines there, he was depressed. He did not want to be there. He felt like he was experiencing real combat fatigue. And He thought at this moment that he's losing his mind. Between the whispering and the footsteps on the roof and seeing this person with his fist raised. And so instead of telling people that he had potentially just seen this person out along the perimeter of their OP, he started to convince himself that you're just losing your mind. You're stressed and you're hallucinating. You just gotta calm down. For the rest of the night, he would not see the figure on his thermal or anybody out there, but he would hear whispering behind him. He kept hearing footsteps on the roof, but he would go out and no one would be there. So by the time the sun came up, he really thought that he was kind of losing his mind. And so he went to his leadership, Sergeant Green and Corporal Lena, and he told them about what had happened the night before, about seeing the figure that had disappeared and hearing these whispers and the footsteps. I mean, he really thought that he was losing it, and he requested to be transferred, and they granted it to him. And the other 7 Marines were really upset about that. They felt like he was kind of abandoning them, and they were really critical of the reason for him leaving. They're like, oh, you're just playing the crazy card. You're just making that up so you can leave.
That does happen quite a bit. I've heard stories about people who would try to claim that they were, I don't want to get into that type of aspect, but people that would claim moments of hysteria or moments where they were thinking about committing suicide, and that they would tell stories about how they would have the barrel of their M4 or M16, they would put it up against their chest, and then to them it was supposed to be joking, but some people didn't take it as a joke and just immediately took the rifle away to let someone know, just to be on the safe side. And then obviously, because say for that person, right, not for this guy, but that person gets sent back to stateside. But in this guy's scenario, I mean, obviously he's very freaked out. I can completely understand that. And from the guys that are probably pissed off at him, I would say it's more likely that because when someone gets pulled out, right, or you lose someone of the squad, now you're having to put more weight distributed on people who are already most likely fatigued, not only physically, but most likely mentally, obviously because of all the shit going on. So now other people have to pull that weight. So this is kind of one of those scenarios which it's like a little, I can kind of see it on both sides. I don't know, man, because this is something that, honestly, again, I wouldn't know unless I was in that situation.
Leave this crappy place, that we don't want to be here either. So they were not taking seriously what he claimed happened. They just believed he was using the crazy card to get out of being at OP Rock. Just a couple of days after...
Oh, so real quick. So it was the Corporal Lena and this guy, I forgot his name, Hoyt. So only 2 guys have been seeing weird shit going on, right? And then I would assume a lot of them, or at least everyone saw or heard about that they had found these bones around that trench, right? So 2 people are specifically seeing these weird shit at night so far.
After Zolik's departure, Lena is on guard duty.
Zoldyck.
In that guard shack, and as he's looking out, Ugly Betty starts barking really aggressively towards the area that Lena is looking at. And so he raises his night vision goggles and he's scanning the mountainside looking for any sign of people that perhaps Ugly Betty has sensed. And he stops when he sees what he believes is a Taliban scout standing on the mountainside, who's pretty far away, a few hundred meters away, and he switches to his thermal scope to confirm that it's a person before he engages. And when he raises his thermal scope, there's nobody there. There's no heat signature anywhere. But Ugly Betty is still barking like a maniac in the direction of where this potential scout was standing. And so Lena goes back to his night vision goggles a second later, and he's looking, and he sees the same scout now about 100 meters closer to him, way closer to him. Impossible to cover that distance in that amount of time. He practically falls over when he sees it. He switches to his thermal and he's getting ready to engage, but there's nothing there. And this is all happening in a matter of seconds. He goes back to his NVGs and he's looking and there's nothing there. And as he's about to go to his thermal for one last look, he feels a tap on his shoulder, which he believes is going to be one of the other Marines that must have heard him frantically moving around in the guard shack. And when he turns, there's no one there. There's no one anywhere near the shack. All 7 are asleep in the middle of the camp. At this point, Lena felt bad because he was critical of Zolik, who had left because he had heard voices and seen apparitions out in the distance. And here's Lena, the second in command of the group, having the exact same experience. But over the next 10 days, Hoyt, Smith, and Wilson would all have very similar experiences in that guard shack. And after a while, they all began sharing their stories, and they all realized that Zolik probably wasn't lying. And
It's also one of those instances, right? Say, obviously, you're not going to believe it, most likely, because it hasn't happened to you yet. It's kind of also, say, when you get injured, right? People I mean, obviously in the military, Marines as well, they'll call you a pussy, a bitch, even if it's like a buddy of mine during his first deployment broke his ankle. And at first, he didn't really realize it was really broken because he said he was able to walk on it and everything, but he said he felt like an intense pain until they eventually ended up getting an x-ray on it, and people were making fun of him. And then it wasn't until someone else also gets injured, but the injury isn't as severe. I think it was just a sprain. But now this person, it now doesn't get made fun of. I mean, obviously because the person know who he was and the fact that this guy was kind of really favored. There's a lot of instances where nobody really cares, or they think it's all bullshit unless it happens to them, or unless they go through an experience, right? So now, obviously, these guys are starting to go through it as well. So now they're thinking that he's most likely wasn't lying, and there's just weird shit going on.
We were unfair to be critical of him because we've all experienced this now. Then on day 59, the day before they're scheduled to leave, all of their radios go dead. All of them. And Lena goes over to Gibbs, who is their comms guy, and he's like, what's going on? And Gibbs was like, I've been working on the radios this whole time we're here. I've changed nothing. They've always worked. Now, they did have a satellite phone, but it was an unreliable way to get in touch with reinforcements if you really needed it. They're pretty much isolated at this point, and they're all just sitting there, just hoping they can get through one more night without any problems. Wilson is the one actually in the guard shack, and then all of a sudden, machine gun fire opens up right outside of their base. And Wilson is totally caught off guard. He has no idea where it's coming from. He's trying to call it out to the guys where they're getting shot from. And all the other Marines are scrambling to the walls. They're taking cover behind the Hescos. And as they're laying there, Lena runs up into the guard shack with Wilson. He's like, grabs him and he's like, where are they shooting us from? And Wilson's like, I have no idea. And it's like, it's so loud. There's all this gunfire coming in at them. And as Lena and Wilson are trying to figure out where this is coming from, they hear the distinctive sound of an RPG being fired at them. It's a rocket-propelled grenade. It's like a whistling sound, and they know it's going to hit them at any moment. The two of them brace for impact, and they hear the sound of this RPG smashing on the side of the OP, and the machine gun fire is just continuing. It's a non-stop. And so a couple of the other younger Marines basically low-crawled their way into the trench where they were protected from these rounds, and they're thinking, like, we got to make sure no one's in the trenches. And so they start clearing the trenches, but no one's in the trench. And it's just this constant barrage of gunfire. They have no idea where it's coming from. And then just as suddenly as it started, the gunfire stops and it's silent. As soon as the shooting stopped, the Marines did not just poke their head up and say everything's fine now. If you're being shot at, you assume that even if there's a break in the gunfire, they're going to start shooting at you again. And so for hours, they're just like waiting for the next round of fire to start, but they don't even know where it's coming from. And they're kind of isolated and exposed. So they're all just kind of like hunkered down against the Hescos waiting to respond to the next volley of fire. But it never comes. And when the sun comes up, they're able to take stock of the damage to their OP from all the machine gun fire and from the rocket-propelled grenade. But there's no damage. No one had ever been shooting at the OP. There was no damage. So they had no explanation for it. So when reinforcements arrived, they just wanted to pack their stuff up and get the heck out of there. And they did. After leaving OP Rock, very shortly after...
And then going back also to the beginning, right, where the British were just kind of really, really willing to just want to get out of there. I can really understand now, like, if I was in the situation, all this shit's going on, I can't just tell them, like, hey, we got fired at, we had an RPG shot at us, but nothing was damaged, right? Like, there was no damage to the Hesco barriers, there was no damage to anything that was there. I mean, how could you explain that, right? They'll just think you're crazy, and then that's it. So... definitely more understandable now. Dude, I wouldn't even know what to make of that, man. I mean, a lot of this, from what it's seeming like, obviously this might be going out on a bit of a reach, when they were digging up those bones, right? I'm assuming, if it was paranormal, I'm assuming it's dealing more with ghosts, right? Obviously there was a little bit of a Russian, like the Russian speaking. I believe he said there was some Russian writing on that engineer spike. So I'm assuming there was a battle maybe between people in Afghanistan going against the Russians, and I'm assuming that there was a huge battle here, and that if it was, that maybe these people are the ghosts, right? Now, bear with me here. If that is the case, then at least from a paranormal perspective, I guess it would make sense. I mean, I don't know about ghosts, man. But I mean, if they're 100% legit, like you can literally, if you know what I'm trying to get at, I can see why that would probably be the case. It's just a bunch of ghosts there, or probably Taliban, or whoever they were. But that's kind of what's going through my head right now.
Smith, Parker, and Diggs, 3 of the 8 Marines that were there, were all killed in Afghanistan in separate instances. And then Sergeant Green, who was their leader, was very badly injured in an IED blast. Lena believes that when they were digging out those trenches and finding all those bones, that they unleashed something. It turned out a lot of people had lost their lives on that little strip of rock. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, they captured OP Rock and killed all of the Mujahideen that were located at OP Rock.
Called it. But I would also be curious to see what happened to the guys who were British. Like, what happened with them? I mean, obviously, they said, make sure you bury everything, right? So I'm assuming they reburied it, right? And once they did, probably that's where it kind of just stopped happening for them, right? Even outside of there. And I don't remember him saying that these guys reburied those bones. I think they just kind of stopped digging and just left it at that. So I feel like that was probably why.
Then the Taliban came in and they took back OP Rock from the Russians and killed all the Russians that were at OP Rock. Then Americans came in and took back OP Rock from the Taliban, killing all the Taliban that were there. So you have all these people, probably dozens and dozens of people that at one point have been holding OP Rock, that had all been killed at OP Rock. And so Lena believes that it's only a matter of time before this curse that they unleashed comes back to get him. So I'd love.
All right, so let's go ahead and talk about this for a minute. Now, obviously, the paranormal side of me really wants to say, hey, this actually did happen, and there's some scary shit that goes on in the world, right? And the other side of me is probably thinking combat fatigue, just fatigue in general from standing post, being there physically, and then seeing those bones, all that. It just wants to say it's fatigue. But I would say I'd lean more towards the paranormal in this case. Hey, if you believe in ghosts and all that, hey, up to you. I've had my own similar experiences. I had more actually outside the Marine Corps, and all of them weren't necessarily something too big. It's just things that I couldn't really rationally think out. So as far as when that little story, when I was in Syria, there was a post called BP4, and it was the one closest to where there was like a little city or a little town, and then I was with my buddy, which ironically was actually the buddy who had told me the story about him going to the pier, doing his little post, and then his friend tries to scare him, almost accidentally shoots him, right? But when we were there, it's a 2-story, so the bottom is an actual building, and then the top part is just, it kind of seems like it's just the roof, essentially, but then you got your sandbags up there, you got actually built up a little bit of fortification, you got your camping netting all over the place. It was retrofitted with like wood and all that to make it like look a little bit taller, but just to be able to give you like some coverage from the sky, right? Now, the bottom part is where all the scary shit would happen. Especially, I got stuck with the night post a lot, and from what I had heard was that this is where ISIS would actually keep women, where they would do some pretty horrible shit to them, right? And that people would hear like weird noises, hear voices down there. And honestly, at the time, I was listening to like a lot of creepypastas, a lot of scary stories, so obviously that started to play in my mind, right? And then there was one night specifically where me and my buddy were about 3 to 4 hours into our shift, right? So like about halfway through, all of a sudden we hear noise downstairs. Okay, so downstairs, right, there's actually a big little just cutout section of the wall that you would walk through, and then going in, there's a little door that's made out of metal, and it's got like a little window with like bars in it, right? And there's this little big piece of metal thing, just like a metal slab that we put up against the door to jam it in place so that no one can open the door, right? Because we got to make sure that no one's going to be walking up on us. And then whenever the our SG would come, he would come in, radio us, saying, hey, I'm going to be at the door in a couple seconds, just come downstairs and unlock it for me. Cool. So we start hearing noises down there, right? And I'm thinking, well, the only other way to get to where we are at, because you can't get it in anywhere on the bottom floor unless you go through that door. you can't get to where we are on the second story, or essentially the roof, unless you go up this little, I forgot what it's called. It's like a little safety slide. So like if one of us got injured, it would be lower down there instead of having to carry them down the stairs. That was the only way to get up there, right? But we had a clear view from it, and it's very noticeable if someone tries to walk up it. But we started hearing noises downstairs, and I'm thinking, hey, if someone's messing with us, hey, let's go mess with them back, right? Clearly hearing like someone's walking down there, right? So, come about halfway down the stairs, pull the charging handle back, right? Now we're gonna round in the chamber. Obviously, I'm still keeping it on safe, figuring out the trigger. And I have my little light on my PEC 16, and I'm flashing around, and I verbally say, hey, I'm condition 1, which I probably should have just said, hey, my gun's loaded and ready to go, because I don't know who would be down there, right? I'm like, hey, my gun's condition 1, come out, right? Expecting someone to come out, but and say, oh, maybe it was just Jug, maybe, I don't know, maybe it was one of the people that actually work in like the little, teeny little markets that they have inside there, but nobody said anything. So I told him, hey, just stay at the stairs, have the radio on you, I'm gonna go just, because there was only like one room on the left, or direct left, a little room that I could clearly see in, right, like about at a 45 degree angle, and then a little bit, if you went straight and then to the right a little bit, there's the door. If you go directly to the right, there's another little room. So I checked the room on my right first, while my buddy's looking at the other little 2 rooms on the left. No one in there. Cool. I go into the other rooms, right? As soon as I start going in there, nothing, right? Nothing at all. All of a sudden, I'm coming back, and I'm like, hey, probably just some animal or something, right? Maybe we're just hearing things, maybe we're just tired. And then I realized that that little piece of metal that we used to wedge the door closed is knocked off to the side, right? Now, I didn't hear, like, when this thing would hit the ground, it would make a laudable, like, bump on the ground, right? That's a horrible sound effect. But we never heard that sound, right? And typically whenever one of us would do it, we would always hear that sound. And through that little window with the bars that is off to the side of it, you can wedge it out. But even if you do and you manage to knock it to the side, we're still going to hear it, but we never did. And I'm looking at it, and it's off the ground. Now, we always made sure that this door was secure because we just didn't want anyone coming up behind us. I'm not freaked out initially, but I'm thinking, okay, that's pretty weird. And I tell my buddy, so I put the metal slab back in the wedge. We go upstairs, and I just keep feeling weird because I keep looking down behind me when we're going back up the stairs. So when you get back up there, I think around 40 minutes to an hour later, start hearing more sounds. All right, and I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna go check it again. So this time I said, hey, probably not gonna be anything. Just stay up here, right? And I go down there by myself. At a certain point, I actually thought my buddy was a little more scared than me. I was a little creeped out, but I was like, hey, there's no way anybody can be. First thing I do, I look to see if that metal piece is still wedged in the door. It is. Quickly look, right? Go to the room to the right. Nothing in there. As soon as I start to come out of that room, I swear on my life, when I'm coming out and I'm seeing the other 2 rooms on the left, I can already see in the little room, there's most likely nothing in there because the walls weren't really like concaved in the inside, so I could see like pretty much straight in. I swear to God, I saw a shadow moving, and when I saw that, I stopped, right? Because for like a second, I'm thinking, oh, maybe it's because I'm moving. I got my light on, right, on my PEC 16. I see the shadow continue to move when I'm standing still. So I'm like, is there someone outside? So I bolt right up the stairs, and I try to look over the edge. I'm like, hey, I asked my buddy, did you see anybody outside just now? Right? Because I'm assuming maybe some kind of crack or something on the wall. Like, I'm really trying to just be like, somehow maybe someone's on the outside, and the illumination of the light maybe just caught the shadow of the person. And I asked my buddy, he said, no, I didn't see anybody. Did you hear anybody? I only heard you downstairs. And I was like, okay. Obviously, we both went down there again, fully checked the little rooms, no one there. And I just thought, well, if I hear a noise down there, I'm just going to go check the metal slab. If it's still in place, I'm just coming back up. I'm not going to check anymore. I'm fucking done with that. But for a while, even though our initial goal is to look out to the town, right, / little city, he was more doing that while I was mainly more continuously checking the stairs. And my worst fear is to see a face looking back at me at one point that I did look down, right? So that was one of the few nights where we didn't do the whole thing where we had one person sleep in for like an hour and then switch back and forth. We were up pretty much the whole night that time. So that was my little weird ass experience. Obviously nothing too crazy except for that shadow. Really did freak me out. I didn't want to be on the post anymore. But obviously I was stuck there, and then I just hoped nothing ever really did happen, and nothing ever really did. Obviously you hear like a little clanging every now and then, but didn't think too much of it. So, bit of a mouthful. But if you have any stories, anything like that, feel free to let me know down in the comments. I'd be very curious to kind of see what your experiences were as far as paranormal while you were in the military. It doesn't matter what branch, especially if you're in an environment that's very isolated. But that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe. It really does help me a lot. Hit that dislike button if you didn't like it. Helps me improve the channel. Leave me a little comment as to what it may have been. And I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.